Hello, my name is Lara Polak, and welcome to my short presentation in developing oracy across the elementary grades. Before diving too deeply into the subject matter of oracy, I'll give you a brief outline of who I am and where I'm coming from. I actually began my first degree in the Faculty of Commerce, and I transferred out after 2 years. Like so many other students, I really just wanted to be done school as quickly as I could, and so I merged any class from my commerce background into wherever it would fit in education, which allowed me to earn a minor in social studies. It wouldn't have been my first pick, but at least I was able to use my courses and I was able to keep on moving. Lucky or unlucky for me, I'm not too sure which one it is. I ended up with a part-time contract in my first year as a graduate, and I was not teaching the language arts component. I was in a 1-2 split, but I realized very quickly how all the dimensions of language arts seeped into all the other subject matters. Oftentimes, my students could work through much of what they needed to through speech. It was more or less expected for them to be using written language or reading. And so I started thinking about this a little more, even as my own children came through the school system. And I started to notice that it was very acceptable for students to showcase their learning, express themselves through speech in pre-kindergarten, play school, preschool, and in kindergarten. However, there became this expectation at some point in grade 1 that these children would now be readers and writers. Maybe less so writers in grade 1, but most certainly readers. And I would pay attention to people around me, and I often caught adults in my life, friends and family both, speaking to themselves. And anytime I'd ask them why they were doing that, they said that it would make things clear to them. And so I sort of started to wonder that, if a fully developed brain that has lots of experience with language, you would presume as an adult, needs to talk out loud to clarify some things, why isn't that isn't afforded in school? And so I started examining my own practice, and I started asking my kids more and more when they were speaking in school and perhaps when they weren't. And I was curious as to why and how this might change over time. As an elementary school teacher, you will always be pushed for time. I feel like there is never enough hours in a day, but I think it is important to acknowledge that the oracy component of the English language arts dimensions is there for a reason, and I think that oracy matters for several reasons. One is that it's foundational to thinking and learning, and not just for children, for many of us. In fact, recent research points to successful speakers and listeners as successful readers and writers. It's also very important to well-being. We all need to be able to express ourselves and communicate to successful members in any community, whether that's in school or not. I can only imagine what it feels like as a child to be unable to express yourself in a way you know how when you're at school. It's also important to prepare students for what's coming after school. And I'm noticing more and more with web development that meetings are being hosted not through email and not necessarily through a phone call, but through video conferencing. And so students need that background and they need that experience in speaking in academic and work-like ways so that they can do that as adults once they leave school. It's also important for social equity, as there may be students in your classroom who have very different ways of speaking at home and may not have an environment at home that can teach them the differences between their speaking at home and their speaking at school or any other sort of formal context. So if you don't teach them at school how to use speech in more formal environments, such as, say, the classroom or in a restaurant, can you really guarantee that they're going to acquire those skills, and are they going to be disadvantaged if they haven't acquired those skills? Next, I've made a brief list of ways that you can promote oracy or speaking in your classroom. There are many more than this, and I would encourage you to look at some of the new resources that are coming out of the United Kingdom in particular. So one way you can encourage oracy is to actually explicitly teach ways of speaking. So there are ways to politely disagree, and there are ways to encourage people that aren't engaging in a conversation. And some of them are more helpful than others. It's also a great idea to have your students talk in an unstructured way during snack times in your classroom. From my experience and from my children's experiences, snack time is often a time when the teacher puts a book on the smartboard or some short video on the smartboard. But this is a great time for students to get to know who each other are and to even share the unstructured conversations that can happen in a school day. You can also have students discuss before and after reading and writing, and even during reading and writing. As a teacher, I think the most benefit for speaking came from my students in grade 2 through writing, when I had them think about their writing before and share it with somebody, and then I would stop them multiple times in the process of writing and have them share it with somebody and dialogue about their thoughts and ask for their partner's thoughts, and then even after writing, talk about the process of writing, what went well, what didn't go well, and where they want to go from there. So I think it's important to think about those ways that we can incorporate talking into other practices of language arts. You can also use other subject areas to really flesh out oracy in your classroom. For myself, science and social studies were both subject matters that I could very much make orally structured, but you do have to be intentional in what activities you're choosing to do with them. You can also use apps that allow sharing with family and with classmates. Seesaw is really popular for kindergarten to grade 2, and Flipgrid is very popular thereafter. Both almost emulate social media, so kids find it very engaging. In the younger grades, you can role play familiar situations, such as shopping, speaking to a teller at a cash register at a grocery store, or even eating at a restaurant, how you would speak to a server. Something that I stole from Jody Carrington is the phrase, "tell me more." I find that students would often say something to me, but it would be a fragment of a thought. And I found myself as a teacher wanting to fill in the blanks for them. But Jody Carrington would say, tell me more. And that would allow the student to share more of what their idea was in the way they wanted to without being prompted from me. But you can also use prompts to get students talking, and students generally love to use things that are creative, like iMovie and Chatterpix. You can also use structured activities such as sharing circle. You may have seen similar activities where all students sit in a circle, the speaker holds on to something like a rock, and whoever has the rock is the speaker, everybody else listens. I have used this and seen it used for everything from classroom presentations to solving classroom issues to just allowing for discussion time among students in case they want to check in with each other and see what's going on in each other's lives. Hands down, I think the easiest way to get somebody talking is to have them tell a story. But sometimes we have a very narrow vision of what it means to tell a story. So I'd encourage you to think to yourself about times that you've told stories, and I often remember for myself stories that I've told around the fire and what makes a good story and what doesn't. Often these oral stories can turn also into written stories if we want them to, but I think it's important for sometimes for them to just remain spoken stories. So if you like the idea of having a spoken story, a great idea is to use technology for support. If students are recording it, then you have evidence of what they have done. So here's some ideas of stories that they can tell about themselves. They can tell a story of introduction or a proxy introduction. They can use an interview, and I've seen interviews used quite a bit with my kids in their schools. They can use a journal which they speak instead of write, an autobiography. They can tell a forecast of what they're going to be doing in the next maybe 5 minutes, 5 years, 10 years. They can tell us a story of a nightmare. Students love to talk about made-up nightmares, and they often get together and talk about nightmares that are similar and have had. They can also tell stories of memories. And of course, not all stories need to be real or authentic. Sometimes they're a blend of authentic and inauthentic. They can also create stories. So some stories that they might want to create to tell through speaking are stories about scary things, funny things, things they like or dislike, strange foods, anything about their home or places they have lived, magical creatures or magical objects. Students are often very happy and willing to share stories of their own histories, of their childhood up to date. And sometimes you can help this to be jogged by a student by having pictures sent to school. They might come in a photo album, or you could have parents share a slideshow. This really engages the child and the student to recreate what has happened in their life, and they love to share about themselves. One activity that I did as an elementary teacher in creating stories was tall tales. So we would play games such as Two Truths and a Lie, or play Liar's Contest, both of which I found very interesting as a teacher because my students all believed that we were in game time, much like, the 7-Eleven game, but it was tall tale time, and they did believe that they weren't learning anything. In fact, actually, we were just playing games, which is always a win in my opinion. Then, of course, there's always the more traditional stories that sometimes people think of, such as folk tales, the fables, parables, fairy tales, and the more updated and changed tales that we're beginning to see sometimes in books, but kids can make these up themselves as well. Myths, historical figures, urban legends, and ghost stories. Some of my students' favorite stories were also the what ifs, and often students could make these prompts up themselves. So we would have a question such as, what if you reached into your closet and your shirt slapped you? What if you woke up in the morning and you were 78 years old? My son had a prompt that said, what if you woke up and you were an adult? What would you do? So these can be incredibly creative or very, very simple. And often students will give you ideas of what they want to speak about or what they want to tell a story about. So don't feel like the pressure is all on you. Engage your students. They will often tell you. In closing, I'd like you to take a moment to think about what your experience was of speaking in elementary school, if you can remember that. When I speak to my kids, most of the time, they would say that they really don't talk at school. And in fact, their opportunities for speaking are very similar to what mine were. And I mean, I feel like they shouldn't be that way 30 years later, but here we are. And I think sometimes what we have done and where we have been more strongly affect our teaching practices than what we know is a better quality education or better practices in the classroom. Something that I really struggled with, especially as a new teacher, was this sort of notion that a good class was a quiet class. In fact, I had a coworker who worked right next door to me. And after I'd finished my master's degree, I started to really understand the value of spoken language. And my class, it wasn't super loud, but it was definitely louder than most other teachers because my students would work through things through speech in addition to the other dimensions of language and literacy. However, there was a parent one day that right in front of me, and I think almost to sort of teach me a lesson, told the teacher beside me what an amazing teacher she was. And this was apparently demonstrated by the excellent control that she had over her students because everybody was sitting at their desk working quietly. And so I'd challenge you to think about unpacking that a little bit and considering what if a quiet class isn't actually necessarily a good class? And what is it that your students need? Because every year this is going to change. And also really challenge yourself to not go back to what was done with you, but to consider what is important for students now when you think about the worlds they're moving into. I like to remind myself that my own children in elementary school, when they talk with their friends, they're not texting, they're talking through video. So it isn't just their spoken language that's important, but also their body language that is important and is communicating messages. And I wonder if all kids are getting the same opportunity to learn that spoken language and some of the more subtle nuances of that at home and which ones are not. And because of that, who's at an advantage and who's at a disadvantage. Thank you so much for listening. I will post a link or two if you would like further reading or reviewing. There's some very interesting stuff happening, especially in the United Kingdom right now. Thanks again.